having Discord open, so you can turn that off. Do we have opening opposition?
Yeah, we're here.
Excellent. Do we have closing government?
Yes, closing government is here.
And do we have closing opposition?
Yes, we are here.
Excellent. So the way timing is going to work is I'm going to put one hand over the camera for 1 minute, one hand over the camera for 6 minutes, twice for 7 minutes. If no one has any questions, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to begin the case.
Am I audible now? Am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
All right, I'll be starting in 30 seconds. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The superficial feeling of culture that one insinuates from their home countries is not more important than your quality of life, your economic integration, and the overall struggle.
Is anyone else lost audio?
Yeah, me.
Okay, excellent. I have paused the timer. Sajid, just go to let us know when you've reconnected. I'll send that to the chat.
Hello, sorry, I got disconnected.
Yes, absolutely. You are welcome to start your speech again if you would prefer. You only got to 19 seconds. Okay.
All right, I'll start again. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The superficial feeling of culture that one insinuates from one's home country is not more important than your quality of life, your economic integration, and the overall struggle of racial bias that a children has to go through while they're in school, that the otherization that they face while they are in different conditions, that they have to integrate within the society. What do we propose? We have two-step model. Note that firstly, that remittance workers, people who are willing to go back to their home country once, are not part of this debate for obvious reasons, because they are sending money to their home country and they're necessarily going to go back after their job is done. Secondarily, parents do not have to dissociate from their home country under this form of debate. That is not a burden that we have to push. That is to say that any form of immigrant that necessarily do not have permanent residency is not part of this debate. So we have 3 points. First of all, why is it better for first generation immigrant children in the first place? Secondarily, how does it help integration? Thirdly, we'll talk about why abandoning the attempts is very important for both the home country and also the integration within the new country and the unique struggles that comes along with it. Firstly, let's characterize the first generation immigrants and how they come about. Understand that they presumably left the country for good because maybe they found a better quality of life in there, because maybe the country offers better social safety nets. For example, in their home country, they might be opposed to like incidents of rape, there is no rule of law, and all of these things are disturbing. That is why most people immigrate to another country for a better quality of life. Thirdly, there might be some economic opportunities which gives them better job security and better unionization of those jobs, which gives them the potential to earn more, and they are start switching for a better chance of survival in those immigrant countries in the first place. That is why people do permanent residency in the first place, because they get a better trade-off in such circumstances. So presumably you will never, as a first generation immigrant, you'll never want, at least possess the will to return back to your home country. So the connection that necessarily you want to maintain superficially is not justified in the first place. Secondly, how does it help immigration in the first place? Because understand that they will have to spend the rest of their life together in that particular country. It helps in assimilation in different ways, because understand that the most important problem that immigrants face is that the otherization of the factors, right? And especially with children, since they're very malleable and they do not understand how racial biases work, they necessarily get otherized in various communities because probably they wore something of their own origin culture. For example, Adivashi might wear something that necessarily propagates their culture, and necessarily get mocked for it in and of itself. So the cultural integration is a block when you actually follow the cultures of your home country, when you actually represent yourself in a way, because people see you visually and they judge. But necessarily what this is going to come to is that when you start to adopt the new identity that you possess, let's say you migrate to USA, you necessarily start to adopt the new identity, and this adopting of new identity is essential because you're better able to relate to that country, because you're better able to spend with your school friends things like Thanksgiving, things like programs like St. Columbus Day, and all of these things are necessarily part of your culture, and you enjoy it with your friends. With a culture that is so separate, people start to otherize you better because you necessarily are not essentially a part of that culture in and of itself. So racial otherization increases on their side of the world, while we try to assimilate children better into the society, because they are going to live their lives for the rest of their life. They're not their parents. So basically this integration helps in them in adopting the culture well and mixing with people in and of itself. Thus assimilation happens better. Secondly, why abandoning the atoms is very, very important. Firstly, note that you don't uphold the culture anymore while you superficially recognize that culture in and of itself. Because when you are born in USA and you are a Bangladeshi, you necessarily cannot uphold that culture because you're not born in Bangladesh in and of itself. So there's a biased possession of culture anyway. The immigrants living in USA do not in any way represent the perfect representation of culture. So it will be a very shallow representation of culture at best. We do not think that this is a necessarily a good thing for upholding the culture of Bangladesh, because people are going to presume that this is what the culture of that home country represents through you, and you have never been to that country. We think that's harmful. Secondly, when you maintain a dual perspective, you do not necessarily have the avenue to exercise a single identity. That is to say, you cannot integrate into the political machinery. Presumably, if you are a first generation immigrant, you are a minority in that country. Necessarily, you need to have political representation. You need your power to vote, and all of these things, and your sufficient ways to integrate in the economy in and of itself. So this political assembly, integration into the political and economic sphere is very important for you. The moment in time you do not opt out of that culture, this tend to necessarily dissociate yourself from that home country, because the home country and from that new country, because the new country wants you to integrate, be an American first, necessarily to vote in the culture. In our world, we get more representation in the culture because we necessarily make you look like one and make you necessarily behave like one. That necessarily enables you to have more representation, to have more say in the political structures that directly influence your life. Now, they might say that this might be some way of reminiscing their culture. Understand 2 points. First of all, children do not necessarily have to do that because they didn't live in that country in the first place, so they don't have to uphold that cultural value. But secondly, they're probably not exposed to that culture in the first place to feel that passion. And since they have to spend the rest of their life, parents are going to put them in schools that are necessarily related to the new country. That parents have a moral obligation to not put them through that objective bias in and of itself. But lastly, let's talk about how the parents will actually adapt to this scenario. Understand that you have lived as a first generation immigrant, you're probably trying very hard to integrate within the country yourself. You have limited time and resource to adapt because you are working multiple jobs, right? You're not going to stop it every step of the way because necessarily you have since you necessarily have a tough time to integrate, it is unlikely for you to have to teach both the cultures in and of itself to your children in a perfect possible way. So basically there's segregation of identity happens. Look at vernacular particular schools in Malaysia, right? Tamil people, since they want to uphold their culture so badly, they're often segregated from the political structures and political representation as a minority. As a result, they suffer. Their children suffer. They are led into a life, and that necessarily costs them every form of representation that happens in economic, political, and social spheres. Reciprocity doesn't exist because you do not bear your national identity anymore. You do not bear the political narrative of your home country anymore, and you do not possess any value of economic importance to your country. That is why you should sever your connections from that. We believe that first generation immigrants face a unique struggle of integrating into the other country, which nobody has to. Essentially, if you want to progress further and build a better quality of life, you need to have strong opinions about political ideologies and leave your country behind, and essentially make your children, you are liable for making your children better integrate within the country structure to make their lives, quality of lives better. Very proud to debate in the finals.
Kia ora, thank you very much. I would like to welcome the leader of the opposition.
Hello, am I audible? Is it okay if I don't turn my video on because there's some fluctuating?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much. I'll start in a few seconds. Right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Thank you, Honorable Panel, for being wonderful. Honorable Panel, I understand that before going on to the debate itself, better characterize what first generation immigrants look like and how do they live into their lifestyle, or how do they opt into the culture, or how do they opt into the new country that they've come. Right. Before moving on to that, you need to recognize the fact that even we recognize the fact that these will probably move or opted into a better country for a better quality life. But recognize the fact that in their own country, they're probably the most privileged people. They're probably the people with the most opportunity. They're probably the people who fed off the most benefits of the taxpayers' money. They're probably the people who fed off all the resources that the country had with their limited fundings. Right? They probably had all the best quality education. That's why they probably in the first place could move into the better country in the first place. Right? Secondly, recognize the fact that they have just immigrated in the country, i.e., they have very strong societal links with their own family, their own community, and they probably themselves in their home practice their own culture to begin with, right? Recognize the fact that when you just move on to a country, most Indian subcontinental country or probably Asian countries also practice their own home culture or their own national culture in their homely grounded or their home environment or their communal environment to begin with, right? Thirdly, also recognize the fact that they probably don't have that much secured financial position or that much secured communal position in the new country to begin with, right? Recognize that how they're strongly dependent on the communal links that their own communities in furthermore immigrant lands gave them, right? Recognize how Indians, the newborn Indians, but any immigrants themselves are largely dependent on the Indian community or the Bangladeshi community or the Pakistani community living in the UK, right? Or the cultural bubble that lives within, right? Given all that scenario, given all that contextualization, we believe that the debate that the opening government does come up and show you does not happen to a large cases and are large not inclusive are inclusive to a large extent, right? What do they come up and show you, right? They come up and show you how this cultural feeling is very superficial. We'll show you how in our integrated constructive, how it is not, how this cultural feeling is very strong, and often when you're forced to opt out of it, you feel a certain sort of identity crisis, which is extremely problematic, right? Secondarily, they come up and show you how this will right away remove all the racial biases in cases of children, right? We're going to show you how this is not actually very inclusive to begin with, but because recognize that this sort of racial biases does not necessarily happen because you follow your own cultural practices every day. It's not like when you go to school, you wear sari every day. An Indian kid wears sari every day, right? These racial biases happens because of things like your skin color, because of your accent, because of things that you cannot move, that you cannot remove right away, even if you want to opt out of your culture, right? Recognize the fact that these are inherent. These are intrinsic things of yours. This will stick to you, and eventually you will still you'll still have to face racial biases overall, right? Recognize the fact that they also come and talk about when you follow your own culture, you probably can attend other social gatherings, etc., and cannot integrate better. We don't see why that's necessarily true, right? We see people joining all sorts of other social gatherings all the time, right? We fail to show any way of mechanism here, right? also understand they come up and talk about how it will not be a proper valuation of culture. We don't also see why that would be true. And I understand that given all that true, what we're going to show you, right? We're going to show you how this follows a certain sort of identity crisis, because you see your parents following a certain sort of culture. You see your families living in that new country following a certain sort of culture. But in your school or in your social environment, you're forced to be a different person when you don't know where you have been from, why your mom and dad speaks an accent, why you have to following certain sort of other accent, why you're following repeated racial biases, even if you are an American or Western culture or whatsoever. This leads to a certain sort of identity crisis and a dilemma that you cannot get out of, even if you opt to as a so-named Western culture to begin with. Right. Recognize secondarily, which is more importantly, it's very financially difficult to opt right into a different Western culture to begin with, for a country, for a family, or for a person who just moved into as an immigrant. Right. Recognize in that sort of reason, we often see how these sort of cultural bubbles help their own community to grow and learn, to probably get a job, to probably get a better holding of that, because they have a strong communal bonding, because the Indian community have a strong communal bonding. That's why they help you financially to probably get a job to another Indian shop, to probably get a part-time job, etc., etc. We believe that when you opt out of all of these things, it becomes extremely difficult for you in that volatile position to actually stay into the immigrant situation. And thirdly, recognize the fact that, which we believe is extremely important, that the child themselves, the first generation or the second generation immigrants themselves should have an informed choice of what sort of culture and identity they want to opt out, or they want to opt into, rather than just forcing into Western culture whatsoever, just because they're probably going to live there for the rest of their lives. Right? We believe that this is extremely problematic, because secondarily, we're going to show you how this leads into certain sort of mistreatment, and the racial biases that they come up and talk about actually doubles down, because the children at that point doesn't know what to do, why he has to opt to Western culture all of a sudden, why probably even if he or she has interest in wearing sari in certain sort of cultural gatherings, why she cannot do that. These sort of things, and we believe that prevents the child to have an informed choice to believe it. We believe that the child informed choice of both the country's culture, what the countries probably come up with, and finally should have the ability to decide what should be his ideal zone of comfort. Right? We believe that also does not happen in the opening government's world. Right? Finally, we're going to show you how, given all the privileges that the first generation has probably had, it's probably a principally immoral thing to do in the first place. Right? Recognize the first place. You got most of the opportunities of the country. You got better education from the taxpayers' money, from the limited resources that the country had. And right now, recognize the fact that not only remittance workers send money to their own country. Most of the time, this Indian community, when they grow up, they serve to a large extent of building communal structure in their own country as well. They serve certain sort of communal infrastructure building, communal funding, communal school and college building, etc., etc., in their own motherland and in their own native land. Recognize the fact that when you opt out of these sort of all cultural links, it becomes extremely difficult for these countries to grow. And also recognize that we believe that principally these people do have the burden, when they do have the capability to do so, at least contribute to some extent to their own country financially. Right? We believe that if this thing applies to the remittance worker, principally the opening government agrees to the fact that yes, the immigrants do have some sort of burden to contribute to their own country, and they're just right now opting out of it. Right? We at least need to say some sort of mechanism at least how the differ between remittance worker and this first generation immigrants to begin with. Right? Finally, we're going to show you how this results into some sort of generation gap, i.e., finally results into more family conflicts to begin with. And we're also going to show you how eventually, when you opt into your own culture, or at least when you have an open opportunity for discourse, this eventually will result into more opportunity for discourse. Right? Ultimately, it will remove the stereotype. Ultimately, it will remove the things that it will remove the idea that the American, that probably all Indian Americans probably look like and act like Rajesh Kutrapali, probably all Asians have faced tiger parenting, and etc., etc., and the stereotyping that comes down with it. We believe that when people probably at least to some extent fulfill their cultural identity, or at least to some extent hold their cultural heritage, these sort of activities can be removed to a large extent, and we believe ultimately that results into a better immigrant lifestyle. Thank you, honorable panel. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. I would like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
I'm sorry, am I audible?
Yes, you are now audible.
All right, I'm starting my speech in 10 seconds. Take it up, please. All right, I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So understandably, the opening opposition gives us first scenario where they think that networking with fellow immigrants is particularly analogous to creating activist attempts to establish a link with the origin country. First of all, we do not think that networking with your fellow immigrants is not an active attempt to establish link with an origin country. That is to say that if an immigrant who's willing to network with fellow Indian community outside their own country, we do not believe that that constitutes an active attempt to establish a link with the origin country. And why do you think that? Because establishing a link with an origin country means that you are actively trying to pursue or push your children to opt into certain cultural elements that comes from your origin country. You push them into certain cultural practices that comes from your origin country as an active attempt to establish some sort of link. And therefore, the part where they talk about having some community bonding regarding to fight off stereotypes, to fight off racial prejudice, and to fight off any sort of things that they try to defend of seeking communal bonding is not part of the debate particularly as well. But let's move on from there. Let me talk about why we believe that how attempts to coexist in a dual identical space actually disrupts integration attempts. Let us talk about what it means to be the children of first generation immigrants and what it means to live life when you're trying to balancing into two dual cultural elements. First of all, the differences of culture and practices is something that plays a very unique role in an individual's life. It not only shapes their opinion, and it also shapes that how the response to conflicts regarding any ethical concerns and regarding any historical conflicts and regarding any sort of moral dilemma that they face abroad as a children of immigrant. That includes, but is not limited to racial prejudice. That includes, but is not limited to religious stereotyping and whatnot. So their views regarding religion and polity is shaped by the struggles they face as an immigrant, right? And we believe as association with cultural elements are what constitutes identity. We believe association with cultural elements from proximity has a far more greater impact in constituting a person's culture identity. And from that point on, let us say, on the other hand, links with the origin country have only superficial meaning when you think about it as the impact it will have on an individual's life. It does not convert to any political or socially meaningful asset or strength. It only converts to emotional baggage more often than not. Let us illustrate that. Look at an average person, an average schoolgoer, the children of first generation immigrants who has to opt into radically different practices in their household in an attempt to keep a connection with their origin country. That same person sometimes opts into completely opposite practices outside in an attempt to integrate more with their adopted country. So we believe this duality and lifestyle is detrimental in multiple ways for a person's life. First of all, it gets toxic in one point and harms the consistent mental peace. It instills more often than not some degrees of self-doubt and some self-worth issues. And why do we believe that is more important than fighting off prejudice through communal bonding and any sort of establishing link thereafter? Because understand this, the person that is being questioned in this particular debate is very young, and he has to live the rest of his life in that adopted country, in the scenarios of that adopted country. We believe the particular tools that they need to take into them to fight racial prejudice do not come from the established links or cultural elements from the origin country, but those particular tools and those particular narratives that they need to fight off prejudice comes from the adopted country's narratives as well. That is to say, they can get into liberal optics into their adopted country, and they don't need to get hold of some degree of cultural element from their origin country to fight off racial prejudice and fight off anything as well. Finally, secondarily, why do we believe this is very toxic? As time passes on, more often than not, conflicting cultural practices simply creates hatred and disgust for the origin country. We're talking about a very young person, and this is an unintended consequences that can be prevented if the active attempts are abandoned. So when you compare these two sides regarding opening opposition and our position regarding this debate, you get to see that we are not only talking about the person in question who has to opt into dual identical space. We are talking about the political future and the political positions that person will take in future. We are talking about the conflicts that will shape that person's identity in future. And we believe at that particular point in their life, that at any attempt to push them into an identity that only has superficial meaning, any attempt to push them into an identity that will keep them questioning their identity for the rest of their lives is an attempt that simply disrupts integration process. integration process and whatnot. While we talk about this, we need to think what the point that opening opposition tried to show regarding the principal immorality of the action of abandoning any attempts regarding establishing a link with the origin country. First of all, we do not believe that any immigrant child should carry any burden that puts them through the peril of opting into a dual identity. Secondarily, we do not believe that is exactly a particularly strong instrument to fight off prejudice and to fight off stereotyping. And the opening opposition does not give any mechanism as to how this could be an instrument to fight off racial prejudice and racial mechanism and whatnot. We think of immigrant parents and opportunity seekers as do the opening opposition does. But these opportunity seekers, we do not believe that their attempts regarding any connection establishment with the origin country does hand them out through some necessary tools which they can use to fight off racial prejudice. We believe a more better option would be to just let the persons in question live their life, let them opt into the connections they seek in their attempt to integrate into the greater society as well. We believe this brings in better opportunities. Before moving on, PY from any side. No one? Okay, continuing. So particularly that problem regarding this integration attempt is sorry, I just dropped in, so I was starting. Particularly regarding any poverty regarding in immigrant, we believe economic obstacles and struggles are part and parcel of a first generation immigrant's life. And why do we believe regarding this very poor minor citizens? Why do we believe that an attempt to establish links with origin country is an extra burden on these very poor minor citizens? We believe these people are gonna be a very big part of other economic activities of the adopted country. What it means is that these people have not only limited resources regarding this, there are any attempts regarding establishing a connection with the origin country, particularly means this attempt is more often than not is a one-way attempt. The origin country does not reciprocate in any meaningful way to alleviate their positions of problems from their adopted country as well. And this not only puts a lot of pressure on the immigrant family, not only puts an immigrant pressure on the family as well, but it also puts a pressure in the entire community. The community bonding that they talk about is particularly not an active persuasion regarding why they should opt into immigrant, why they should establish a collective attempt. We believe those networking attempts are particularly just a consequence of moving into a new country, and therefore nothing else regarding this. And this should not be construed as an attempt to active establishment, connecting active establishment with the origin country. Therefore, the parts of that opposition tried to say are not very good regarding this debate. It's very proud to propose. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you very much. I would like to welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Okay, am I audible? Okay, give me a few seconds, please. Okay, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Honorable Chair, first of all, the second speaker of the government side comes up and tells us that communal building is not a part of debate. Why is it part of a debate? The motion clearly says that you are going to completely abandon attempts to establish any link whatsoever to country of origin. Try to understand, these communal communities are built upon cultural exchange. This promise of cultural exchange, this promise of exchange of empathy and sympathy is the foundation of these communities. When you abandon all sorts of, every attempt to establish link to their origin country, these communities breaks down. And I will come back to later in our constructive why this is problematic. Okay, and now let's talk about why they talk a lot about these dualities of culture, right? First of all, try to understand that these individuals should have a flexibility, a freedom to choose which cultural components they are going to attain in their life, which is to say that they form their independent lifestyle. They are not totally dictated by one or two lifestyles. They make a combination. They have different components. And we believe this flexibility, this choice should be there. And in governments, well, there is no choice. You would aggressively integrate it to the Western culture or the new country's culture, which is problematic. And secondly, try to understand the most of the conflicts in culture comes from the religion, and in the policy of the government, you're not removing the religious practices, right? So this problem is still going to sustain in the government's world. And try to understand, culture is flexible, but religion is not. And that is why what we're saying, that cultural integration is important. And this is why we believe that the duality is not very problematic in respect of culture, but it is problematic in respect to the religion, which is not mutually exclusive. Okay. And now they talk a lot about how this like identity is superficial, right? They talk a lot about how like these little children are getting like exposed to new culture. This is, they do not represent their culture totally. But try to understand why this is problematic. First of all, we don't see why this is a must. Why we don't see why you have to be 100% accurately representing your culture. We don't see that's the problem. And second, try to understand, culture itself is not monolithic, which is to say, inside a country there are variations of culture. You see urban areas, you go to the rural area, there are lots of variations of culture. The urban areas often tend to like adopt Western cultures, Western components of culture, which is to say the culture of a country, of community itself is not monolithic. So we believe the idea that you cannot properly uphold or represent your culture is utterly pointless. Okay. And try to understand, there are other means by which people, or in the Western countries, people can know about different cultures. There are documentaries, there are movies by which people actually get to know about the real cultures or like the rural cultures of some countries. So we don't believe this is the only way that you have to promote or represent your culture. And finally, let's talk about stereotypes. Try to understand. As my previous speaker have shown you, the stereotypes basically comes from your color, your facial structure. When you see a Chinese person, you don't have to listen to their accent. You don't have to see what their dress is, right? Their dress code is. You simply see their facial structure. You simply say Chinese are good at math. So there is no correlation whatsoever to the cultural practices to stereotypes. So we believe their idea that stereotypes sustain where you like hold the cultural values of your native country. This is not the case. And now let's move on to our constructive. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to talk about why the sense of belongingness is very important. Try to understand, as I've already shown you, that most of the people, maybe some of the people are quite liberal, very welcoming, they welcome you to their new country. But we believe that most of the conservative people do not welcome you to the country. They treat you as second-class citizens. Why? First of all, the difference is color, religion, race. And try to understand, in government worlds, this idea of second-class citizens actually doubles down. Why? Because they are going to now see that you are aggressively trying to imitate our culture. This is problematic. When a culture sees that another culture is being submissive to one culture and like trying to directly imitate their culture, this is going to like create a more sense of second-class citizens, and this is going to be more harmful for these people, right? And we believe we have talked about this communities, right? And why this community is important. When you face this kind of micro level hostility in your daily life, you need an environment of comfort. When you see a person of your own color, when you go to their own community, they can simply sympathize with you. They can empathize with you by simply looking at you, by having like one conversations. And these structures break down in government's world. And this is very much problematic in micro level and everyday life of a minority person. Okay, and now let's talk about why. For an example, and why these communities are so much important. Try to understand, the Bangladeshi community is in London are quite like strong, and they have strong political presence in some areas, right? And why this is important? This is important because the majority, whenever there is a policy that is probable to harm these minority communities, this strong political presence, these communal structures actually is a good resistance toward this harm that is done through politics and social structures. And these communities are very important in this debate. And try to understand why this huge generation gap is problematic. Try to understand when there is going to be, you are going to like teach your children to aggressively integrate to the new culture, what happens there is like a sudden generation gap. And this is problematic because first of all, there is a huge gap in understanding in family. And try to understand, in a person's life, family is one of the most crucial factors in their mental health. They have to face their father, mother, brother, sister every day in their life. And to have like a cultural understanding with them to exchange. So, for example, if your father do not laugh at your jokes, this is very much problematic, we believe, because this is very much going to harm your like social well-being and your mental peace, your like domestic health, right? So we believe this idea, the generation gap is very much problematic. Try to understand that my previous speaker have talked about how we have a huge responsibility to give something back. Try to understand. And she have shown you the justification why you have to give a lot back because of the privileges you got from the country. That is why you are in the developed country in the first place. And I'm going to show you through what are the structures by which you are going to give back. First of all, this comes in the form of remittance. We're not talking about the labors that government put aside in this debate. We're talking about general citizens who are new to country. They give back to their families. They give back to their cultural communities, which is to say, and they directly invest to the infrastructure of the rural areas or the underdeveloped areas of the country. And secondarily, the communities, the organizations we talked about, these organizations actually do some like humanitarian work. They invest in the underprivileged sectors of their country. So we believe these structures break down when you like remove all the links to your origin country. And we've also talked about how this hurts the choice of like freedom to choose between cultures. We have talked about how these organizations are important, and we believe we have shown you enough reason as to why we have to sustain these organizations. We have to sustain the links to your previous culture. Thank you very much. We're very proud to oppose.
Kia ora, thank you so much. I would like to welcome the government member.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Just give me some time to arrange my paper. Okay, I'm setting up my camera. So just going to do two things in our speech. First, I'm going to break the deadlock on opening debate on how do we reduce the racist treatment to the child in political spectrum, economic spectrum, and cultural sphere. Second, I'm going to explain why the cultural dissonance and the crisis of identity that the child will experience in their life will be massive in the opposition bench. So firstly, in the opening bench, it is a deadlock. Because OJ talked about how suddenly cultural integration and assimilation will lead into better treatment to the child, but OO also talk about how the racist behavior will happen regardless because they have intrinsic immutable characteristic, which is the different skin color. So she's going to be the one to give you the analysis on why racism to these children will be less likely to happen, considering on how the political system, economic spectrum, and society's reaction will work in three different ways. So first, I think a lot of times the individuals are not racist from the moment that they are born. Racism is a social construction that could be constructed and reconstructed. It is that there are indeed racial prejudice to the child of immigrants that are untrue, such as they are inherently criminals, or they have inferiority in terms of their genetics, or they are inherently lazy. Exactly the way that we can counter this potential racism and stereotype and prejudice is by having our child in the interaction and exposure and communication with the general population child, so they are able to have the ability to understand each other more, that the actual white kid, for example, will understand that actually Indian child is also hardworking, contributive American that could contribute to the nation, that they are having the specific individual trait that couldn't be just generalized, that they are also some individuals that could be fun to interact with, that they are also someone that have the ability to positively interact with us. Exactly when we talk about like immigrant child and the way they can interact in our sub house is we're going to more likely put them in public school, and in their sub house to establish link with their ancestral land, they are going to more likely put them in the ethnic school, for example. But exactly in our sub house, because child still can be constructed, they are not inherently racist, right? They can have, they are not having this, stiff, solid idea upon how immigrant minority child will look like. So we can reconstruct their mind and outside the house. But the second, especially when we talk about the political context, there is no analysis on what is the political context on a lot of Western nations right now on how they will respond to the life of this minority in our side of the house. First of all, especially in the context of this right-wing populism that exists in the US and a lot of European nations right now, in the context of there are a lot of right-wing media that try to fearmonger the minority by creating a lot of propaganda to them. Exactly, we need to counter them in our side of the house. Exactly, in our side of the house, we are going to have this constant interaction between our child and the child of the white people, for example, instead of putting them in enclave at ethnic school. So more likely, we are going to be more likely to change the political preference of the general population, because sure, we're not going to be able to target into the most conservative general white kid or white family on our side of the house, because they're still going to be like Trump hardcore fanatics anyway. But we're also not going to be more likely to change the liberals' mindset in this particular country, because they're still going to be willing to vote for immigrants-related policy. But what we need to pander is the gray area individuals that can still be changed in terms of their political preference by showing them that we are not individuals that have been displayed or fearmongered by the right-wing media. So we are going to be more likely to have more voting bloc to pass for the policy that are related with the immigrant child in our side of the house. And I think that skin color is not the tipping point why individual can be racist, because if you talk in US right now, African American generally has more rights in comparison towards the Mexican immigrant, because African American are granted in terms of their citizenship. So because African American also have more interaction with more white people instead of like a lot of immigrants that put themselves in ethnic enclave. So we can still change this racist behavior in our side of the house. But third of all, when we talk about economic opportunity for the future life of the child, I have some clarification towards opening opposition, because first, it is untrue that what time it is. I forget to turn on my timer.
You are at 4 minutes and 28, giving yourself a bit over 2 minutes left.
Okay, so better economic opportunity will exist more in our side of the house, because first, it is untrue what Oo told you, that these are the privileged individuals that can move to this new Western nation simply because they have money. Because a lot of times that these immigrant family move to the Western nation because of the persecution, civil war, or they are just want to fly away from the poverty that live in the nation. So we need to talk about the economic incentive of this particular family and the child. But second, it is also untrue that ethnic enclave will give the best economic incentive because they have solidarity, because they have like strong economic capital. That is untrue, because a lot of like Indian individuals that live in US right now, when they want to economically flourish, for example, that CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai, he is not living in ethnic enclave. He's living in the like corporation that is built in US, multinational corporation, because he knows that there is better economic opportunity if he move out from this particular ethnic enclave. And that is the reason why a lot of ethnic enclave, most of the time, only try to operate in specific comparative advantage of economic opportunity that is not flexible at all. In our side of the house, we are going to give this individual better economic opportunity, like in better cooperation with better outreach in our side of the house. How does this correlate into culture? In their side of the house, when this child has worse life, when they are being racist, they get racist treatment from general population, when they don't have enough economic incentive, they start to hate the culture, because they're going to think that the reason why I am poorer, the reason why I get this racist treatment is because I hold my belief on this cultural ideology that makes them resent their parent, that makes them resent the cultural value that they have, because they're going to associate the worst life towards the idea of the culture that they have. But second thing about the cultural dissonance and the crisis of identity, I think this is going to be much worse on their side of the house, because on their side of the house, the dual identity of the child that need to be endured makes this child will feel guilty if this child watches, for example, Hollywood movie or listen more into Western pop songs, because they will feel like they are betraying the cultural value that their parents want them to subscribe. But if the child listens to Indian songs or Indian movies, the child will feel like they're entirely different with the friends that are listening into more Western pop songs. So either you have cognitive dissonance, that you are not okay with your identity, or you are going to have a sense of self-alienation on their side of the house. This trade-off makes the child will need to endure like always second guessing their choices will have a sense of confusion and hamper their construction of process of self-development. They're going to be afraid in choosing the kind of agency, the kind of self-identity that they're going to be holding in the rest of their life. I think this is the most important argument in today's debate, because regardless of the political and economic context of this Western nation that they move in, the idea of self-development and second guessing and limiting the idea of the ability of this child to construct the meaning of their life is something that is inherent, that is irregardless of the context of this debate. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. I would like to welcome the member of opposition.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Oh, okay, thank you. Hold on a sec. Okay, hey guys, I'm gonna bring you two main arguments from closing opposition. First, I'm gonna give you parental rights, why parents have a moral responsibility to teach the traditions, the culture that they're growing up with. And secondly, I'm gonna talk about the practical consequence between parents and the children. And we think this is a debate about the relationship between parents and the children. We don't think this is a debate about how children are going to tackle with immigration policy or whatever. Before moving on, let's be clear about our stand. We don't think parents will prohibit children to hang out with the local people on our side of the house. We think it's okay for parents, for example, let their children hang out with the local white people if we are Chinese immigrants, right? So we think that trade-off that like entire government side try to prove in this debate doesn't simply make sense, because we think it is possible for their on our side of the house to for the children to know what kind of culture that they actually want to choose, right? So moreover, we think if they are legal immigrants, I think they are able to, for example, access to the educations that the American government provide to them, right? So I don't necessarily see the unique importance of immigration policy, because they are treated like Americans, right? Just like white people. So we don't necessarily see the importance of immigration policy at all. We think they will be able to integrate with the local people. And I don't necessarily see the importance or necessity from government side, right? So let's move on to my first substantive about the parental rights. We think that this policy, this motion says that on the government side, they are going to abandon the attempt to establish links to their country of the region, right? So government side says that if you can maximize the happiness of the children, parents can do anything they want. And for maximizing it, they can abandon attempt to establish links of their country of the region, right? This is crazy logic. We think that violence can be very useful to like make your children study really hard. Nonetheless, we prohibit it because it is not the children's choice. So we think parents have a moral responsibility to teach the background of themselves if children want to, because children themselves didn't consent to this growing up in an area that they are susceptible to the discrimination like open abortion gave you. And secondly, we think children have the right to know from whom they are born, because they didn't actually consent, right? Since it's impossible to get consented who they are, like, because they don't actually have the right to choose their parents. We think on the principle level, parents have the moral responsibility to inform who they are and what kind of environment that they are growing up. And if you have any PO, I will take you now. Okay, there's no one.
Yes, there is a POI.
Okay.
So why do you, we do believe that the cultural conflicts do happen in the immediate space. So please show us how an attempt to establish links to a culture that you have left will lend you any meaningful instrument that will facilitate integration to a completely different and often hostile culture. We expect a mechanization.
I don't think it is our burden to prove that like those people will be able to for example, not integrate with the context that they give you. I think it's your responsibility to prove why it's extremely difficult for your side of the house for the children to integrate with the local people. And we think it is entirely possible. So let's talk about the relationship between parents and children. We think this is the most important thing in today's debate to be talked about. If you have to cut all the opportunities to learn about backgrounds of the parents, what it will look like, it's like a parents won't be able to speak their native language at home. They want to be able to cook the traditional food. They want to be able to take those children to meet their grandchildren or whoever. We think it is going to be extremely difficult for parents to communicate with the children because they cannot tell what they really want to do. They cannot nuance because like their language ability might be limited compared to the children's ability, right? So we think there is a language barrier. It is going to be really difficult for children, parents to tell what they want to. And B, we think those and like they don't know how to educate, right? Like Asian parents know how to educate like Asians, but they don't know how to educate like Americans. So we think like it's going to be really difficult for the parent to educate them. So we think for both parents and children, it is going to be really frustrating to live together because they cannot really talk to each other. They cannot really establish a relationship between parents and children. They cannot really communicate each other in a meaningful way. So we think it is going to be really difficult for them to understand each other and respect each other because they are both alien at home. And secondly, we think that to know who the parents are for the children is very important. So what is going to happen, like if you are immigrants, first generation immigrants in France, for example, if you are eating a restaurant, and if you're Japanese, for example, if you're eating in a French restaurant, you are gonna meet a lot of French people there, right? And they're gonna be say like, oh, look at they're Chinese, and they're gonna be say like, oh, go back to your country or whatever. Then you are gonna question at some point in your life that why my color is different from like white people, or why like my parents speak different language than other people or whatever, right? So we think they will question about who they are and what kind of person their parents are, right? So if you do not teach anything about themselves, we think it's going to be really difficult for the children to understand the parents, because for the children, they are truly integrated with the locals. That means that they cannot really understand because they are aliens, right? They are totally same as white people, how white people seeing like Asians. So we think it is going to be really difficult for children to respect the parents because the parents are the people who do not really speak good English, or those people who do not really cannot say anything that they want, right? So, but if you tell what kind of tradition that the parents did growing up, which you can tell that like what kind of culture that they actually like belong to, we think that like children might be able to understand how fantastic it is to be Chinese, so they can be proud of themselves being Chinese because because it is very fantastic, and like the history that they like parents or like their ancestors built is really good, right? So we think that they will be able to respect their parents and their own culture compared to the government side. We think that they will be able to meaningfully engage with the parents and children. We think the relationship between parents and children will be much better on our side of the house. And since we proved you the principle level, and we proved you how it is better for both the parents and the children on the practical level, we think we won this debate. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you very much. I would like to welcome, to close the government side of this debate, the government whip.
Test, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, wait, I'm gonna set up my camera soon. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, This debate is a third-party perspective debate. That's to say that KEIO cannot scrap away the communal benefit they provided in the entire tree bench except them, right? Because understand, if they want to frame this debate to talk about only parents' interests, they have to prove why then that particular interest is the most important interest in this debate, or two, why then that interest gives a net benefit that are accumulatively bigger than three other benches, right? Because understand, on our side of the house, what we're trying to prove to you, that makes sense. It's we're trying to prove why then the livelihood of the children and the parents in and of itself will be much, much better. So even if we have to talk about parents and children relationship, we say that the ability for children to have a social interaction that is good, the ability for children to have an economic opportunity whatsoever are still important, which has no response at all from member of UP, right? Sadly. So with that, two things in my speech. One, I'm going to engage to CEOs about parents' obligation and responsibility to teach this culture and parents-children relationship. And second of all, I'm going to engage to OOs about children's future and how then enclave and communal communal groups are not something that is good for the children. So firstly, let's engage to CEO about parents' obligation, right? There are two things in that speech. Firstly, they say that it is parents' obligation because the children are not consented to be moved to Western countries and all that. I don't get it, right? Children are not consented to be born at all. So it means that the parameter of you to give the children's benefit is not which culture of origin that you're supposed to be born at, but what culture that gives you the maximum benefit when you're living. Exactly our argumentation that proving why then integration and assimilation to this Western culture are the one that could give you a better social interaction to a better economic opportunity. So in that parameter of constant, I think that it is achievable on our side of the house, because I don't understand why this the link of countries of origin that they're supposed to be born in and the new country that they're born in on closing opposition side, which is like the parameter does not make sense. So in conclusion, that one, either this principal argument does not make sense at all, but two, even if you wanted to count about consent, I think CG's proposal about how then we give them a better future for the children in and of itself is answering this particular principle of consent, right? But second of all, they say that about parents and children relationship, how then parents are unable to teach Western culture because they only know Indian parenting or Bangladeshi parenting, right? Because one, this is too technical. You could literally learn about this particular culture prior hand. And two, moving out to other country means that you already know what kind of culture that you're going to face on, what kind of language that you're going to speak and whatsoever. So I don't think that it's true that parents cannot have the ability to teach this, because understand, what do we mean by teaching and integration? One, we're going to put you in public school. We're going to put you in a neighborhood which has white people, for instance. This kind of thing are the things that are feasible without any prior experiences in teaching what culture per hand. So I don't think this concern is valid. But second of all, they said that, oh, no, there will be no connection whatsoever from the parents because the children can speak English, the parent cannot. Dude, the one who moved to like Western countries are the one who can prior hand speak English, otherwise they couldn't survive, otherwise they cannot have a job. So I don't necessarily think language barrier whatsoever becomes an issue. But exactly, right, this disconnection and this association will happen on your side of the house because you constantly force the children to eventually learn this origin of culture while they are born in a world where they watch white entertainment, where they watch white cartoons and whatsoever, so they have no association whatsoever to the origin culture. This is exactly why parents and children's relationship will be worse off on your side of the house, because you're forcing the children to accept information that they don't have relatability of, because when they're put into this world, this is something that doesn't exist in their eye, ladies and gentlemen. So in the paradigm of parents-children relationship, we take this debate. But second of all, let's talk about OOs, like children's future. They say two things. Firstly, they say that an enclave will give a better economic opportunity. Second, they're talking about identity crisis of these particular children, right? So first, let's engage through the enclave and whatsoever. So they say that in enclave, you could rely on to privileged Indian or Bangladeshi to give you economic opportunity so you can have a job. My member have proven within privileged individual like Sundar Pichai doesn't live in enclave, but they live in white neighborhood. So I don't necessarily understand how then economic opportunity would exist on their side house. But second of all, even if it's true that it exists, I think that enclave or segregation doesn't happen in vacuum. There are competition. There are like white corporation, like other like identity corporation whatsoever that creates a competition and hostility. Especially when you highlight the difference of identity within your enclave, there is more likely for you to have attack from what corporations and whatnot, because the basis of the economy that exists in opening opposition is identity. This proves two things. One, economic benefit would not be maximum because there's constant attack and competition from white corporation. But two, even if you have economic benefit, you are not going to live your life comfortably because the constant hostility that exists. This is why, thirdly, it's exactly better on our side house because we have assimilation and integration. Here's where CJ is gonna mechanize OGs, right? Because my member have proven how then assimilation and integration works. We said that habituation is something that exists on our side house because there is an instant and constant interaction between these two communities. Because you're going to put your children in a public school, you're going to work in the same corporation as white people, and you're going to be living in the same neighborhood as opposed to live in an enclave. This proves two things. One, less hostility, because the construction of identity and association of immigrant by these white people will be different. Because in our side house, things like merit, things like personality, and friendliness will be constructed during this interaction as opposed to white supremacist propaganda in constructing the identity of immigrant when you're living so far away from this white individual. So most probably less hostility will happen. So like life will be more comfortable on our side house. But second of all, this proves that it will be a better economic opportunity because there is a less likely for competition to exist because you're not seen as a threat of a new economic entity in our side house. Because the reason as to why people hate immigrants so much because they are seen as different and they're seen as taking away their economy. When you associate yourself as American, for instance, and assimilate with the white culture whatsoever, it is more likely for you to be accepted with a lot of information prior hand within the interaction. So in the pattern of economic opportunity, I think CG wins, right? But moreover than that, this habituation will lead to a better political reform, right? Understand that we're not going to like change the mindset of white supremacists because in both sides of the house they're racist, but what we're going to pander is gray area society. Because the analogy with this would be like Beyonce and Kanye would not get that racism because there's a constant interaction living in a Hollywood district, for instance, but the poorest of African American or all of those immigrants are being discriminated because they have little to no interaction. This is exactly why habituation, like knowing the construction of identity and something like that, are something that is important to A, counter the narrative from white propaganda, to B, to be a potential ally for this particular community. Exactly, this is important because one, it mechanized OGs about how then they would get a better political representation in parliament. But second, it answers OO's concern, but how then they would still be discriminated at all on their side house because we say it will be worse because living in an enclave, you're prone to gerrymandering whatsoever. So in that regards, we win. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome to close the debate the opposition whip.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. See my time.
Good luck.
Three, two, one. Panel, as a Chinese immigrant living in Japan, I'm rather happy to teach my children to establish the link with the Chinese culture. I think in our side, we are happy to teach like language or the festival or the food of the traditional origin of these kind of parents. And we think the burden of proof of government side, like they have to prove that they could not even have a link. They could not even know like what kind of country they're coming from. That is like uniquely harmful, we think. So why we think we on our side of the house, when we have the link with the original country, we could have a better opportunity. And we, as the closing government, we uniquely pointed out that why on the principal level, the parents do have the responsibility to teach such like original tradition for their children. And secondly, we tell you like the relationship between, especially it is uniquely important in this debate, is the relationship between the parents and child. It would be better, much better in our side of the house. So before moving on, just two quick things. We think it is not mutually exclusive. In our side of the house, our children could still go to the local school, the public school on the opposition side, and opposition side still they can integrate, they can watch the American TV, and it is not mutually exclusive at all. And secondly, we think what is more likely to happen on their side of the house is that to say the children that will hate their parents or hate themselves because they could not view how the you cannot know like their original of themselves. And therefore, they could like only in our side of the house, our children, they could feel a sense of proud of themselves, proud of their traditional, proud of their original. So in my speech, I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, I'm going to engaging on the case coming from the closing government, and secondly, talk about opening government. So what we heard from the closing government is mainly three things. So firstly, to talk about like they could like communicate or could understand each other more like when they're integrating with their new country. So one response. So why we think only in our side of the house, when we're building a connection or building a link with your own country, it is rather have a better communication with the new country. Why is that likely? Because the people, they're curious when you have maybe a different color, or maybe you are like speaking a little bit different language. Therefore, when the people, they have the interest, they have the curious to know something they don't know. That is the very reason we think only in our paradigm, like the people, they could like sharing and start a communication like by saying their own traditional, like by saying what kind of festival of the Chinese traditional is, or what kind of traditional food such as dumpling, and starting a much more like a nuance in communication with the local with the new country. So secondly, they talked about the political context, which we say it is not likely to link to the debate, but a few responses. So they say like they could have achieved a much more better policy in their side of the house, but we think it is totally not true. Why it is not true? Because we think as when you have the link of your original country, you can know like what kind of country you're coming from. When you're facing the populism, like they're like introducing some Muslim ban, you're more likely to voice out for to against this kind of policy, and that is uniquely more likely to happen in our side of the house. And thirdly, you talk about the economic opportunity, and they say because they could get economic opportunity. But however, we see also on the comparison in our side how we can still achieve much better. Why is likely? As my member uniquely pointed out, that when you have a link, when your parents are teaching you the language or teaching you teaching you how the traditional it is, it's giving you a sense of you can be a bilingual, and by this is a uniquely opportunity for maybe for applying for your job, or maybe for other giving you some employment opportunity. So this is much better. So before we move on, I'll take OG.
So you are an immigrant, you order sushi while having dinner with your friends. So harms are twofold. Your culture gets mocked, and secondly, you feel bullied. Why is that good?
I don't necessarily think it is true, because we're eating sushi and we are having fun, and we can start a communication on why the sushi is being created, what is the tradition of the Japanese, and this is making the communication much more easier, and making it much more interesting. That is very easy to the response to you. So moving on to the case coming from the opening government. So the opening government, they firstly talk about they will only have a shallow or superficial representation of their of their own country. So we think, even if this kind of is superficial, knowing your identity is important in our paradigm, because you can if you are we're talking about the immigration policy in their side of the house, you cannot know it. If you do not know your identity, you cannot even gain the benefits, or you cannot even vote against such policy who are against your own country. And secondly, we talked about the stereotype and the prejudice will be much better in their side of the house, but still be comparative here. And I would say the difference of name or difference of your color is still exists on both sides of the house, but be comparative, and these kind of people are still being minority. And however, we think being minority, and we think it is much more important to understand your identity, to why I'm being discriminated, why I am suffering from such treatment from other people. And in this case, we think when you're knowing who you are and you knowing your identity, it can only bring you a much better understanding of yourself and a much better understanding with your parents. And that is a unique extension coming from our side, coming from my member. So my member also told you that when why it is important for the parents to tell the language, or the sharing, the teaching the language of the children, because we think only in the mother tongue we could making a much more nuanced communication with your children. Let's just say, for example, me, I am a Chinese, and I could not explain everything perfectly in Japanese. That is very important, because we think the relationship between the parents and children will be a little bit shallow, because they could not like explain themselves in a nature. And also and that is the very reason. And also we think the telling them the history and telling them how the history could making them a sense of proud of themselves, proud of their identity, and therefore these kind of children, they could gain a uniquely a sense of proud, or a sense of their belonging. So also, they talk, the Oklahoma government, they talk about the parents, they are not possible to teach both of the two culture. But we think it is not important, because we think they could teach them the language, or they could teach them the festival, or they could teach them the friends. Why in their side it is harmful, because they could not even make friends with their local people. They could not even meet their grandmother or grandpa. And for this reason, we think for the children, it is much better for them to establish a link.
Thank you so much, everyone. Obviously, you can't cross the floor